Hi, my name is Sarah and welcome back to Freshly Read Books. Okay, so I know that I originally said in my Booker Longlist predictions / reactions video that I was not going to do a video just for Such a Fun Age since I read it before the longlist came out and had talked about it in a few other videos, but I do think that it kind of needs to have its own thing just because the implications of being a Booker Longlist book, it is a bit different. It brings the book into a different audience, a different set of eyes. So I do still think that it is good to talk about. Now, I'm not going to go as in detail as the other books that I've done just because it's been longer since I've read this. I don't still have the book. I rented it from the library as both an audiobook and an ebook, and I no longer have a copy of either. So I just can't be gathering quotes and everything, and I didn't read it with the intention of doing a whole video just on the book. So it's not going to be quite like the other reviews that I've done for the other Booker Longlist books for 2020. So I apologize for that, but that's okay because this book is a little bit different in general, at least in my eyes. So basically the way that I want to approach this one is to talk about why I don't think that Such a Fun Age belongs on the Booker 2020 longlist, and then after that, the reasons why I still enjoyed reading it. Because I think that they're both valid arguments, but I want to get it out of the way at the beginning. You may have noticed if you've been keeping up with the videos that I've done that Such a Fun Age continues to fall down the list of predictions as far as making it onto the short list or my personal enjoyment. But before we get into that synopsis, Such a Fun Age is a book about a 25-year-old Black woman named Amira, and she is hired as a babysitter for this pretty wealthy white couple for their 3-year-old daughter, Briar. And one night, Amira is babysitting Briar, and she's got her in a grocery store, and some lady calls security on her, saying that she's worried that she's kidnapped this child that she's babysitting. And so that's kind of the catalyst for how the story starts, but it's about a lot more than that. It's just kind of an introduction into the story, and that scene holds a lot of power throughout the story, but it's not the main thing that the story is about. But it's definitely what the synopsis focuses on. If you read the back of the book and everything, that's the book. I was surprised when I saw initially that it was included. So then I was well, maybe I'm just not understanding what constitutes a Booker book, and maybe my understanding of what books tend to be put on the long list is incorrect, because I don't know much about it, and I've learned a lot more recently, but at the time I knew almost nothing. So I went and looked through the nominations for past Booker long lists and everything, and those, what had won, what had gotten to the short list, all that, and the ones that I had read didn't seem to match up with Such a Fun Age. And then also just looking at the synopsis of Such a Fun Age versus the synopsis of the other 12 books that are on the Booker long list, I think that if you were to just read those out and that was all the information you had about each of the books, it's still pretty clear that Such a Fun Age is this outlier among those. It seems like it wasn't even marketed for the same audience that the other books were marketed for, which I think is why it's so surprising that it wound up on this list. I wouldn't necessarily consider it to be literary fiction, and I don't think that it would consider itself to be literary fiction. I don't think that that was the intention behind it when it was being published, when it was being marketed, when it was chosen for Reese Witherspoon's book club. It was meant for a different audience than the audience that typically consumes the Booker Longlist books. And I don't think that that's a bad thing, but I think that it is setting weird expectations for this book that it's not able to meet. So people now are going and reading it expecting something like Burnt Sugar or Shuggy Bane or one of these other Booker Longlist books, and then they're getting a very commercial book. They're getting a very different reading experience than they would with any of the other books. So I actually went on to Goodreads and I took a look at reviews from when Such a Fun Age was just coming out, versus the reviews that it's been getting recently. And there's definitely a difference. At the beginning, it was getting mostly 4 and 5-star reviews. Now that could be from a number of things. It could just be the people that wanted to read it right away. They're more likely to like it because they were more excited about reading it. They picked it up as soon as it was published. Maybe they got a review copy, something like that. But also one could argue that likely the intended audience was receiving the book at that time instead of an audience of people that are following the Booker Awards and then saw that book. And then later, of course, those people started reading the book, and the reviews all of a sudden were a lot lower. And so you can now see like 2-star reviews, 1-star reviews. There's still some of the 4 and 5s, but it's definitely a big difference. I'm willing to bet that a large part of that is just because people are approaching this book thinking it's going to be something other than it is. Okay, so that's kind of my background with it. Now I want to talk about why I actually like the book. I ended up listening to the whole thing because the audiobook became available to me through my library faster than the ebook did, and by the time the ebook did become available, I was already pretty into the audiobook and enjoying it that way. I would highly recommend it if you're thinking about reading the book to listen to it, because it was a fantastic audiobook. I think that the narrator did a great job, and I like flew through that book. I think that there was a lot that went into that. The other books that I was reading at the time were a lot slower paced books, so I think that that might have contributed to how quickly I got through such a fun age. But I did get through it quickly, and for most of it, I was very curious as to what was going to happen next. It felt very plot-driven to me, but it had a lot of different types of characters, and sure, they seemed a little bit more caricatures than characters at certain points, but overall, it was still an enjoyable experience, and I'm really glad that I went into it not expecting anything like literary, like not expecting like Burnt Sugar or like not expecting like Wolf Hall. Like I wasn't expecting anything like that. So I had fun, I enjoyed myself, and I ended up really liking the book. So yeah, I think that part of it was the time that I read it, the other books I was reading at the time. I think part of it was the audiobook, because since then I've watched reviews of people and they talk about like specific sentences or specific areas, and I'm like, ooh, I think that if I was like reading that like with my eyes, I would agree that it could have been written better in different areas. But once again, like I wasn't looking at it from a critical eye. It was purely just like I'm going to enjoy reading this book, and I did. One of the elements that I thought was really cool about the book, so obviously you probably could tell by the synopsis, a big part of the book is centered around racism, what that looks like, and a lot of it's around false allyship. So the mother that has hired Amira to babysit her daughter, her name is Alix. Well, Alex, but she changes her name to Alix like later in life. And she is like really trying hard to be somebody that is like not racist, which is good. Like it's good to have that intention, but it's very performative. Like it is performative allyship. She's doing it to have that appearance. And I don't even think it's just like that appearance to others. I think it's also like the appearance to herself to feel better about herself. So it's never really for Amira. It's always for herself. And I think that that is an important topic to talk about. But the thing I really like about the way that it goes about it is it feels like Amira is at the center of this story, but she doesn't really like perpetuate anything. She's a relatively passive main character for most of the book. And things kind of just like happen around her. And I think it's interesting to see how the white people in her life kind of are spiraling into this when all they have to do is like not try so hard just to have the appearance of being like a good person. So I think it's funny where Amira's doing like basically nothing, and you can formulate a story about race completely around her. Like it's not like she's this activist. It's not like she's trying to get into this conversation about race, but it just like happens around her because the other people around her feel like it should, just because of who she is, just because of the color of her skin. So I think that that is a pretty interesting way to like go about that story. And it was fun for like the cringy moments and the Thanksgiving scene, and it's just like a bit over the top, but definitely like it was fun. I had fun reading it, and I think if you go in with the appropriate expectations, you will too. I also think that this was good for its audience, like its actual intended audience, because I think performative allyship is something that's either not talked about a lot or not talked about a lot like in that group of people that this book was kind of intended for. So making this be such an easy read, making it be a read that would reach people that read like Reese Witherspoon's book club. Oh, I just realized that my video has been crooked like the whole time. That's fun. Anyways, but that it could be told in such clear terms, like that this is a bad thing, that Alix is not good, that she starts in a position at the beginning of the book where you're like, maybe she is good, like she's trying, I can understand her position, and then throughout the book you start to be like, ooh, this is really starting to rub me the wrong way. And then the same with Kiley, who also kind of like rubs you the wrong way throughout the story, but maybe to a lesser extent. And it's funny to see Kiley and Alix that are kind of on these opposing sides without Amira needing to be like involved at all, which is, I don't know, there's like a lot of like getting offended on others' behalves and feeling like, oh, I know the best way to do this thing, or he's going about it the wrong way, and I can see the fault in him when I can't see the faults in myself, that kind of thing. So I think that it is a good thing for the audience of this book to read, but I don't think it really like goes beyond that. For example, there's in the scenes that you get, so like in the Thanksgiving scene, like you know exactly what like makes that scene bad. You can only really see it in one way, whereas in a book like Real Life, which also deals with race, there's a dinner scene in that where it's a lot of like areas of gray where you can see a bad thing happening over here, but then the main character says something and you're like, oh, okay, that's a bit flawed as well. So there's so many different ways you can look at one situation, and you can like sit in a different seat around the table and think like, ooh, from this perspective or from this perspective. And I think that the Thanksgiving scene in Such a Fun Age is a really like watered down version of that, but it makes it a lot more digestible and understandable. And I don't think that's something to be upset about, but it does leave a lot of people that read it with the thought that it's going to be more like Real Life, one of the other books that's on the Booker Longlist. Then you see this story in Such a Fun Age and you're like, you could have done a lot more with that. But I think that because it's so digestible, because it was meant for other people that aren't necessarily like, they don't want to read this with a critical eye. Like they don't want to sit on the beach and like really dive into this text. They instead just want a nice story that has a deeper message that they can, you know, continue to think about after the story's over, but not necessarily one that they are going to like annotate or like really dive into. So yeah, you already know based off of my other videos what my rankings are. Such a Fun Age is currently at the bottom slot on both my predictions for making it into the shortlist and my own personal preference. It doesn't quite like make it into how I feel when I read books that are meant for something different. But I think that there's a time and place to read Such a Fun Age, and I think I hit that perfectly for me. So yeah, the standings are still the same as they were before this. Such a Fun Age is at the bottom there, but I did want to make this video to say I did enjoy the book. I think you would too if you go into it with the appropriate expectations. If you like books that are more commercial, if you like Reese Witherspoon's books, like her book club books in general, I think that this does fit pretty perfectly into that list. I tend to not like them as much. This was one of the ones I liked more than others. Okay, so hopefully this helped out a little bit. And now that I've talked about it, I feel not so bad about like continuing to see Such a Fun Age move down the list as I talk about the other books on the Booker Longlist. But who's to say, maybe one of the books will end up below it. I don't see that happening, but maybe another one of these books that I haven't yet gotten to will feel like it doesn't belong on this list either. Who knows? But if you want to see more of the Booker books I have done, you can look in the little info card, and also it'll be linked down in the description. So if you want to check those out, that would be great. But otherwise, you know, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.